For those who weren't with us last week, we did a review last week of John's Gospel from the prologue all the way up through chapter 10. I don't know about you, as you were getting back into this, as you picked up your lesson last week and you got back into this, it always takes me a while to get back in the routine. Did it take you a while to get back in the flow of studying and preparing and knowing you had to go somewhere on Monday night or Tuesday morning? For me, that's the thing, getting back into the flow. Okay, plan my week. Now I've got to work on this day because this has got to be done by this day, and do I have to babysit this week? And you got to work out your schedule of how you do things. So it takes me a while to get back into it. And so if I seem kind of scattered tonight, part of that's just normal scatter. But hang in there with me, as we've not been here. We've not done this since mid-November. So as I said, if you were with us last time, or if you watched the video, we did this review of John's Gospel from the prologue all the way up through chapter 10, when Jesus left Jerusalem for the final time. That the next time he would be in Jerusalem would be what you and I call Palm Sunday. And we know what happens in that week. It's that week that will end with his crucifixion. So as we pick up this week with chapter 11 of John's Gospel, this is an extremely familiar story. I dare say there's not a person here who does not know the story of the raising of Lazarus, right? Anybody who said, "Oh, gee, I never heard that before." No, of course you've heard that story. That's one of those flannel board stories, that goes all the way back to our childhood. Except for healing of the high priest's servant's ear in chapter 18, this will be Jesus' last miracle. It's at least his last public miracle before the crucifixion. One writer put it this way. He said it was the last miracle over that last enemy, death. This is a very public miracle. We'll see that as we go along. This miracle was timed to be performed. As I was writing this, I thought, I hate that word performed, because that sounds like something contrived. He performed a miracle. He performed a magic act. And you obviously know that that's not what it is, but I couldn't think of another word to use. In fact, that's what Scripture says. He performed this miracle and that miracle. One translation just says he did the miracle, but he actually performed it. But he did it. Here's the thing that really struck me. Jesus did this miracle with the intent that it would be a public miracle. It was public, on purpose, before a crowd of people. When Jesus raised Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9, actually it's in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, but in all three accounts, when Jesus raised this little girl from the dead, it was a very private miracle. If you remember, Jesus, he made everyone leave the room except the girl's parents and Peter, James, and John. That's all was there. And not only that, but after she was raised, he told them, don't tell anybody. It was a very private miracle. When he raised the widow of Nain's son in Luke chapter 7, there were people around, but this is what I call an incidental miracle. Not that it wasn't a big deal. I'm sure it was a big deal, particularly for this woman who'd lost her only son. She was a widow, so this was her only means of support. But what I mean by that is this was not a pre-planned miracle. Jesus and the disciples were going through this area, and he saw this funeral procession. They were on their way to bury this boy, and Jesus healed him. So it was incidental. It happened as an incident on the way. But not only that, but these two miracles, the widow of Nain's son and Jairus' daughter, those two miracles take place almost immediately after death. We'll talk a little bit later about what the Jews believed about death and about burying, but just to tell you this in advance, when someone died, they buried them the same day. They didn't believe in embalming, so they buried them the same day. So in the widow's son's case, he had just died that day, and they were on their way to bury him. This daughter of Jairus's, if you remember that story, Jesus was on his way there, and he got sidetracked by this woman with the issue of blood. And so he didn't get there before the little girl died. But in both cases, they had just happened. So Lazarus' death, though, took place after 4 days. There was no possibility of anyone saying, oh, they weren't really dead. No, he was really dead. Martha, he stinketh. He was really dead. And this was what I'm calling an on-purpose miracle, a public miracle. Lazarus was well known. This miracle took place, we might say, in the very door of Jerusalem. Now, I don't know about you as you went through this. A lot of times when we know a story so well, we have to make ourselves, and we've talked about this many times before with other scripture, try to make yourself read it like you don't know what's going to happen next. Try to find something in it that you didn't know already. And as I studied this, I really found some things in this that I didn't know. Things that really had never occurred to me before. And a lot of it came even after I wrote your lessons. So this was as I was reading and studying or laying at night just thinking about it. It's like, what does it mean? So it's just, I think it's going to be a neat lesson. So let's talk about the overview. So as I said in your lesson, I'm sure this is a very familiar story to you. Have you ever studied it in its context within John's gospel before? Within the flow of the historical flow of what's taking place in John's gospel. What's new about this to you? Let's just look at all three of these questions together. Was there anything you had noticed before, or what was your reaction to this? What emotion did it evoke? What would you want to say about reading this straight through for the first time?
I think what struck me is in this event that happened, the raising around all of this event, happening at the same time was how fully human Jesus was and how fully God he was at the same time.
Yeah.
He was heartbroken, he wept, but yet he created life again.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah. It's just so hard for us to wrap our minds around how he is both fully God and fully man. Not 50-50, but completely 100%. What else?
I did remember Thomas's comments. That I didn't remember that at all.
You didn't remember Thomas being in the picture at all?
Right.
Yeah.
And particularly him, suggesting, let's just go with it once all about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm anxious to get to that part of it. I liked that part of the story. Thomas is so human, bless his heart. You can just feel with him.
But when you taught that or learned that as a child, that was not a part of the story.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't the focus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think, we talked a little bit last week that every chapter, every book of the Bible has its claim to fame. You think of, and many times a chapter, like chapter 4, we got the woman at the well. Chapter 3, we got Nicodemus, or we've got the John 3:16. Chapter 9, the man born blind. Chapter 11, Lazarus. And we don't know what else goes on around that story. We're just taught those stories disconnectedly. And for me, and I hope it's this way for you, but for me, I learned so much more by learning it in its flow. Learning everything that took place. It makes it real, and I just learned more about it. It sticks with me more that way. What else? Just a reaction to reading it?
Well, Mary and Martha's
deep faith that Jesus could heal. I mean, they were totally.
If you had been here, they say to him, yeah. He would not have died if you had been here.
Just to kind of follow up on the point you made, what struck me is through John, there's miracles, there's giving sight to the blind, there's all these things. But this was personal in that he knew and cared for them. But on the other hand, he knew that Lazarus would be raised from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting, he still was hurt.
Yeah.
He still wept just because of the sorrow. That was...
Knowing he's going to raise him from the dead, he still wept.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right, I hadn't really thought about it in that way, that of all the other, of course, turning the water into wine, that was a personal situation with his mother, but the man born blind and the feeding of the 5,000 and the nobleman's son and the other man with the who'd been lame for 38 years, you think of any of these other miracles there, they were not personal miracles. He didn't have a personal connection with any of them like he had with this one. Yeah, that's a really good point there. Anything else? All right, well, let's look at the questions. The setting. We'll start with the setting. How does John set, I guess it would help if I opened my Bible, wouldn't it? Get to the place. It's a Bible study. All right. How does John set the stage for the story? Look at verse 1. Now, a certain man was sick. Now, remember, this is John. John has given us he's like the narrator in the movie. He's given us the overview information that we need to know about what's going on. Now, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So, there we go. Sets the stage. How do you know these people? Because you know this story, though. How do you know these people? Would you have met them already in the book of John? No, they're not mentioned yet in John. This is the first mention of them in John. You and I, if we don't already know this connection, we have no clue who these people are. There was a certain man. Let me tell you about this man. There was this man named Lazarus, and he was sick. And that word sick there just means he was without strength at all in his body. He lived in Bethany, and he had two sisters. Now, because we already know the story, we know the connection. But we would not have learned that from John's gospel. There is an earlier account, there is an earlier interaction between Jesus and this family, and there's only one earlier interaction that we have between Jesus and this family, and that's found in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. After that, there's three other accounts in the Gospels, but all three of them refer to what John will tell us happens in verse 2, which in the course of events hasn't even happened yet. Verse 2, he goes on and says, by the way, this was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. And anyone reading it says, oh yeah, I remember hearing about that. Now, as I said, it's not happened yet. We'll get to that in chapter 12. But most of those reading this, John's readers, would have known that story. Why? Because the other Gospels talk about it, and the other Gospels were written several years before John's Gospel was written. But what do we really know about these people? In the earlier story in Luke's Gospel, we read in Luke 10 verses 38 through 40, we read, now as they were traveling along, this is Jesus and the disciples, as they were traveling along, he entered a certain village, and it doesn't even tell us what the village is in Luke's gospel, but we know it's Bethany. And he says, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who moreover was listening to the Lord's word, seated at his feet. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, you can imagine her putting her hands on her hips, Lord, do you not care that my sister has let me do all the serving alone? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha. And by the way, anytime you see Jesus use somebody's name twice, that's a term of endearment. That's an intimate reaction. He'll say, Simon, Simon. And he'll say, in other parts of Scripture, we'll see Moses. We'll see the two used many different times. But here, Martha, Martha. You expect him to say, bless your heart. You are worried and bothered about so many things. But only a few things are necessary, really only one. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, as women, we know that story well because we always hear, you need to be more like Mary than you need to be like Martha. We all have a tendency to be more like Martha. We've heard that story before. It's kind of funny. Every time I read that, though, it reminds me of several years ago. We had a pastor who was telling the story from Luke 10, and he said, actually, Martha was upset with Mary because she wouldn't help her with food for Lazarus' funeral. And I was like, I think you got your stories mixed up there a little bit. But the account in Luke wasn't a long time before this incident, but it was at least several months. But anyway, he has been there before. He has been with this family that he has deep feelings before, because you don't just say Martha, Martha to an acquaintance. You say to somebody that you care deeply about. So yet they had this connection. So where is this Bethany? Now we'll see down later in verse 18 that John will tell us that this Bethany was about 2 miles from Jerusalem. Now there is another Bethany. There is another Bethany that's called Bethany beyond the Jordan. John mentions this in chapter 1, verse 28 as being the place where John the Baptist was baptizing. And the reason John tells us in verse 28 that this Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem is to distinguish it from the other Bethany. So we'll know which one we're talking about. But when John began and said, now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha, most of his readers would have already known the people, or at least known the place. And if they didn't, John reminds them again in verse 2, by the way, it was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. And like we said a moment ago, they're like, oh yeah, I got you now. I know who this is and I know where we are. So look now at how the story begins. Look at verse 3. The sisters therefore sent to him, to Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Him whom you love is sick. Well, let's just back up a little bit before that. Where is Jesus? I missed that. Back in chapter 10, verse 40, we see, and he, that is Jesus, went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing. That may have been the Bethany beyond the Jordan. We're not told specifically, but at any rate, Jesus at that time is in the area known as Perea. We talked about that before. So he's gone there, and he's there because of the attempts on his life. Now, true, there was a predetermined time when Jesus would die. We've read this many times. He would not be killed before the right time. Many times he'll say, my hour has not come. They picked up stones to throw at him. Why weren't they successful? Because his hour had not come. All these things take place because his hour has not come. So even if Jesus had stayed right in Jerusalem, they weren't going to kill him because his hour had not come. Still, though, that didn't mean he was to be careless. He wasn't careless about it. And so he went into Perea. So from the rest of this story, we can gather that Jesus is at least a day's journey from Bethany. But then we look at how Lazarus is described. It's not the one who loves you, but he whom you love. Now, I shared in your lesson that the word for love here is the word phileo. So, do you know what that word means? What's that mean?
Brotherly love.
Brotherly love. How did Jesus love Lazarus?
Brother.
He loved him like a brother. Now, we'll see in a minute, he does have agape love for him. But you can have agape love for someone that you don't love like a brother. There's a difference there, or we would say love like a sister. It's a family love. He loved him like a brother. So what do you think they expected Jesus to do? Now look very closely at what they said. They sent a messenger to him saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. What do you think they expected him to do? Come. That's when I was reading this, I thought they expected him to come. Of course they expected him to come. I mean, the one whom you love is sick. When Mother and Daddy were living, and I would get that telephone call, in the middle of the night that Mother is sick or Daddy is sick, they didn't say, would you come? All they have to do is say, Mother's sick or Daddy's sick. And you're up and you're gone. You don't have to be asked to come. So our first reaction to that is they expected him to come. So keep that thought in your mind. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let me ask you this. Did Jesus need to go to Bethany to heal Lazarus? No. He didn't need to go to heal him. How many times have we seen Jesus heal someone from afar? The centurion's son? Who else? The Syrophoenician woman's daughter? The nobleman's son back in Capernaum, chapter 4. Let's see, seems like there was another one. The centurion's slave, the nobleman's son, the Syrophoenician's daughter. I'm sure there are others, but those three came to mind immediately. Jesus did not have to go to Bethany to heal Lazarus. But what's his response to the message? Look at verse 4. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. And I asked the question, who else had a sickness or disease that was allowed to take place for the glory of God? The blind man. Who sinned, he or his parents? And Jesus said neither, but that God may be glorified. And so how did that play out? Jesus healed him. And then we saw the whole scenario take place there of what happened with this man. And ultimately it was for the glory of God. So how do you think, put yourself in the disciples' place. You're somewhere, we're going to talk about where he was in just a minute, but you're somewhere, you're doing these things, and this messenger arrives and says to you, the one that you love is sick. Now, it doesn't say deathly sick. The word just simply means he has no strength in him. The one you love is sick. And Jesus says, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. What do you think is going through the disciples' mind? What are they thinking?
Confusion.
Yeah, they may confusion, question, why is he not going? But anybody else? What else do you think?
They were excited.
Huh?
Maybe they were excited they were going to see another miracle.
They weren't. Well, they're not going to go, though.
Maybe they expected him to heal Lazarus without going because he had done it before.
He'd done it before. Could very well be. They know we don't have to go back in order for him to heal. What about this thought? Well, Jesus is not worried about it, so I'm not going to worry about it. Does Jesus look worried to you? No. This sickness is not unto death. It's for God's glory. Well, everything's going to be okay. He's going to get over it. And this is where it hit me that sometimes, you could essentially say that verse 4 is Jesus' answer to this messenger's message. It's an answer, we could in a way say that it's an answer to prayer. So the answer sometimes, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God. Sometimes an answer, we think we have an answer to prayer, and the answer doesn't mean what we think the answer means. So Jesus says this, and so look at verse 3 again. Lord, the one whom you love is sick. The fact that the sister sent to him indicates that there was a messenger. And you said, well, duh, of course there was a messenger. How did it get to him? But I want you to think about this logically, because as I think sometimes as we read this story, we don't realize that there's an actual physical person that has brought him a message and is taking a message back to the sisters. We just see Jesus saying this and the disciples hear him say it. You get what I'm saying there? You have to realize that there's an actual person that's taking this message back. So we might say, well, of course there's a messenger, but think about this. A messenger comes to Jesus and Jesus replies, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. That's the message that the messenger took back to Mary and Martha. That's what he told, I assume it was a he, what he told them when he got back there. That's what Jesus said to tell them when he went back. The disciples heard him say that. But the message was not for the disciples. The message was to be sent back to Mary and Martha. There's a reason I'm belaboring this point. And it's because according to the timeline, it's very likely that by the time this messenger got back to Mary and Martha, Lazarus was already dead. Now imagine, Lazarus has already died, and the messenger comes back, and you get the message, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. Now, do you hear the message in a different way? That everything's going to be okay? This tells you something else is going to take place here because he's already dead. So that's what they know, but the disciples don't know that yet. John wants us to know in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, why would John tell us that? Why would he just give us that little... is it not obvious that Jesus loves them? Why would John tell us that?
Because staying away, knowing that he's dying or very sick, staying away is not something a really good friend would do.
Yeah. Well, I think that the disciples are looking at it with the attitude of, well, he's not worried, so we're not. It's not that serious. But John wants us to know that Jesus didn't stay away because he didn't care. He loved them. And the word here for love is the word agape. It's that different word. It's that word we hear most often. The word agape is a word for love that has nothing to do with emotion. For God so felt warm and fuzzy about the world that he sent his only begotten Son. No. It has nothing to do with emotional feeling. It's a word that carries with it the idea of commitment or sacrifice. It means wanting what is best for another person. As I said a moment ago, you can love somebody with agape love and still not have a brotherly love for them. You can meet someone and not even know them well and want what's best for them, but not love them like you would brotherly love. So Jesus loved them with agape love. It's like I said, it's a word that means what is best for another person. God so wanted what was best for the world that he sent his only begotten Son.
We might call it Christian love.
Yeah, Christian love. That's exactly what we could call it. It's a word in Greek, Koine Greek, that does mean that. It's a Christian type of love. That's exactly what it is. So Jesus wanted what was best for whom? Martha and Mary and Lazarus. How can letting him die be what's best for him? We'll see. So, what did Jesus do to show that love? Look at verse 6. When therefore he had heard, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed there where he was 2 days longer. Now, you and I, because we know what's going to happen in the rest of the story, we know why he stays there. But if we're just reading this, we're trying to make ourselves read it like we don't know what's going to happen. What's going through the disciples' mind? They get a message that Lazarus is sick. Jesus essentially says, don't worry about it. And they stay there 2 more days. What kind of feeling does that give you? Don't worry about it. Jesus is not worried about it. It's apparently not anything we need to worry about. It's like this. We can be driving along and the car starts making a strange noise. If Joe's not worried about it, I'm not worried about it. If he's not worried, I'm not worried. When we were kids, if our mamas weren't worried about it, neither were we. Right? That's why we have to be very careful what we convey to our little ones. But Jesus is not worried about it. So, hey, I'm not worried about it. We'll get back when we get back. You'll probably be better when we get back. They just go on about their business. But what happened after the 2 days? And by the way, Jesus wasn't just sitting around killing time for those 2 days. Jesus was doing stuff. Most scholars think that many of the events from Luke, chapters 13 through 16, are what's taking place in this interim time. Particularly Luke chapter 15, you'll remember those 3 parables. Well, it's one parable with 3 parts back to back. The parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. Those things are taking place in Perea while this is taking place in Bethany. So Jesus is not just killing time in order to go back. Jesus is healing, he's teaching, he's doing things in those 2 days. So then after 2 days, Jesus says, after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. Now, go where? Go where? Judea. Does he say anything at all about going to see Lazarus? No. Let us go back to Judea. Not let's go see Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house, but let's go to Judea. And the tense there is let us go, is in the tense that's called subjective, which means it was truly an invitation. Jesus is asking the disciples to go with him. Now, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 18, Jesus will say to the disciples, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. That's in the indicative tense. It's, I'm going to Jerusalem and you're going with me. But here it's an invitation. Let us go to Judea. So, were the disciples excited about going? Oh, no. So they say, that's not a very smart idea. Let's talk about this before we go. Verse 8, the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews are just now, and this, it means it's very, very close time to this, the Jews are just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again. Are you sure about this? Are you sure this is what you want to do? We saw that in chapters 8 and 10. The Jews were not happy with Jesus, and the disciples knew it. So how did Jesus answer? Look at verses 9 and 10. Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not with him." Well, what's that supposed to mean? Did you read that and think, wait a minute, this doesn't even sound like it fits here? Actually, it was interesting. On Tuesday night last week, someone actually asked a question about something else. I think it's back where he healed the man born blind, and he says something about working for the night before the night comes. And this, what's that supposed to mean? And it means exactly what it does here. Actually, it's rather than leave you hanging. I didn't want you to be confused about that, so I told you actually what that means. It's a metaphor. Jesus' words are a metaphor for working when the opportunity is there. You and I would say you got to strike while the iron's hot. You got to do it while you can do it, while the time is opportune. But Jesus' words here are both practical and proverbial. By that I mean they're practical in that in Jesus' day they had no outdoor floodlights. You couldn't set up lights and work on something at night. It's not like you go down the interstate and they're working at night and they got it lit up like daylight. So if you wanted to get any outdoor work done, you had to get it done during the daytime. Yeah, I started to say, as I was writing this, I started to say they didn't have flashlights, but they did have the little oil lamps, you know. Your word is a light unto my path and a lamp unto my feet. It talks about that little light that only lights one step at a time in front of you. But they didn't have the big lights, so they couldn't do a lot of outdoor. These little lamps just only lit just a very small area in front of you. So if you had any outdoor work to get done, you had to do it during the daylight. Another thing is that the Jews' day, and we've talked about this before, the Jews' day went from evening to evening, where our day goes from midnight to midnight. But theirs went from evening to evening, and they divided that day into two parts, two 12-hour parts, the day and the night, regardless of whether it was still light. You know, you've noticed, I guess, you know, the days are getting longer. We see a little bit more daylight in the evening and a little bit more light in the morning. That didn't play into this. It didn't matter if it was still daylight. It still figured in to be 12 hours a day and 12 hours or night. But Jesus' words are very practical, but his words are very proverbial, like the hymn. You may remember, work for the night is coming, when man works no more. But also, Jesus' words have a deeper meaning. We might say a spiritual meaning. And that is that Jesus would do the work of his Father until his day was done. We read it as my hour has not come. But it was that day was done when Jesus' work would be finished. But again, the disciples would have understood that. We have to have it explained to us, but the fact that John doesn't explain it, it's just, thrown in there, means they would have known. They would have understood exactly what he meant. So then he tells them where he really wants to go. Look at verses 11 through 13. This he said, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go that I may awaken him out of sleep." The disciples therefore said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus, John tells us this, Jesus had spoken of Lazarus' death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. And let's just hold it right there for a minute. So, did that upset them? Lazarus is asleep. Let's go see Lazarus. He's sleeping. Were they upset? Were they worried? Were they scared? No. Oh, if he's sleeping, it's going to be good for him. He can finally get some rest. He can finally get some good, sound sleep. But in all fairness, we know that they misunderstood what Jesus said. But in all fairness, the words that Jesus uses for sleep here really do mean sleep. Now, they can mean death, but their most prominent meaning is for sleep. But here's the thing that really struck me as I was reading this in my keyword Bible is that every word for sleep in these verses are a different Greek word. And I thought, that's a clue. That's got to mean something. There's a clue there somewhere. So I'm going to read this to you. This is out of the King James Version, which is where I have this numbering system. But this is what it's saying. Starting with verse 11. These things said he, Jesus. And after that he said unto them, our friend Lazarus sleepeth. Now this first word for sleep here in verse 11 means to slumber. Like I said, it can mean someone who's dead, but its primary meaning is to sleep. So he goes on, but I go that I may awaken him out of sleep. Different word for sleep here. But what this means is you are waking somebody up who's been asleep. Okay? Verse 12. Then you can't blame the disciples for misunderstanding. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he sleep, and this is the word meaning to slumber, if he sleep, he'll do well. Verse 13. Then we see, however, Jesus spoke of his death, and the word there really does mean death, but they thought that Jesus had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. And the word here is a word that means somebody that is totally relaxed, getting a good night's sleep. You can't blame them for misunderstanding. It's easy to see how they misunderstood Jesus. But then what did Jesus say in verse 14? Then Jesus therefore said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. This Lazarus is dead. I have to laugh at it. It always reminds me of the story in Joshua chapter 1 verse 2 where God tells Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Like Moses didn't, or like Joshua didn't know it. But God had to tell him. No, Joshua knew it, but Moses, my servant, is dead. But what that means is that time is past. Now it's time for you to take leadership. And basically Jesus is saying the same thing here. Lazarus is dead. And now the time is right for us to go back there. But how does he expand on this? Look at verse 15. He goes on and says, and I'm glad. You're like, he's dead? You're glad? I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. John's all about believing. Remember, that's John's word. He wants you to believe. He wants these disciples to believe. Jesus is saying, if I had been there, I could not have let him die. That's the reason we were not there. What is John's purpose for writing this gospel? Chapter 20, verse 21. These things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Jesus is essentially saying here, this miracle is for you. This miracle is not primarily for Lazarus or Mary or Martha, even though I love them dearly. This miracle is for you, disciples. This miracle is to solidify your faith, your belief. In Matthew 12, 38 and 40, the Pharisees wanted Jesus to do signs to prove who he was. In John 4, verse 48, Jesus told that nobleman from Capernaum, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. In John 6, verse 30, the Jews in Capernaum, they say to Jesus, well, what sign are you going to give us so we'll believe in you? And this was the very next day after the feeding of the 5,000. And we're like, what sign? Everybody wants a sign. In 1 Corinthians 1:22, Paul says the Jews seek after signs. Jesus will not do signs for the religious leaders to prove who he is. But he would do this miracle for his disciples to help them understand, to solidify their belief.
Do you think that's why he waited? I mean, I know he was doing other things during the but for the Jewish leaders to get there with Mary and Martha,
Yeah.
so there could be a public
Yeah, exactly. Everything about this was planned. Everything about this was done on purpose. God's timing is always perfect. We know that. But this is a perfect example of seeing how important the timing is. It had to be this way exactly. But then who speaks up? Thomas. Bless his heart. Not Peter, which makes me wonder if Peter was there. Peter's usually the one who has some smart remark to say. But Thomas speaks up. And what does he say? Verse 16. Thomas, therefore, who is called Didymus, which means the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Does anybody else see Eeyore besides me? We might as well go. We're all going to die. Let's just go with him. And I ask you the question, was he being valiant or was he being Eeyore? What do you think? I lean toward the Eeyore, but that's just what I see. What do you think? Was he being valiant? Was he being brave?
He was just being Thomas.
Huh?
He was just being
Thomas. That's exactly right.
Thomas is, I know we all think of him as the
doubting Thomas, right?
But Thomas was honest.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
And he was always that kid in class that asked questions that nobody else wanted to ask because
everybody else thought it, but
yes.
Yeah.
So Thomas was a good guy.
Thomas was a good guy. Thomas, he was honest. He was practical. I'm not going to believe until I see the nail prints in his hand. I mean, let's just face it, guys. This is what I think.
He wasn't going to fall for just anything.
No, he wasn't. And so, well, we might as well go with it. Well, if we die, we die. A lot of commentators talk about how brave he was and how devoted he was, and he may have been brave and devoted, but I just got this picture of Eeyore when I read that. But however, here's something else. The words may die with him are not fatalistic words. They're not a declaration. The tense of this phrase is subjective, like before when Jesus asked them if they would go with him, let us go. It was an invitation. Here the words are subjective, which mean let us go with him. We might or we might not die, but let us go with him. And let's see exactly how does he put that. Well, it just says that we may die with him, but that may has a question mark. We may or we may not. It's subjective. So I guess he was being braver than you might think, or at least for me in my first view of that. So any thoughts or comments, questions on that section before we go on to the next section? So we'll make sure all that's clear how all that fell in together.
We were talking about the reasons, that Jesus, how this played out like it does. Do you think that this ultimate miracle with raising Lazarus, do you think that kind of all of these people were there, the Jews, and they're going to go back and tell? Do you think this is just, Jesus knows this will be the straw that broke the camel's back, and this kind of just, because Passover is coming up?
Yeah. It is. It is that...
pushing it.
Yeah.
The time.
The timing is getting close. He will do this miracle to solidify his disciples' belief. But there is the other side of that yes, there will be those there that he knows will take the news back, and that will set things in motion that will not be solved. Up until now, everything is just, what's a good word? Opportunistic, maybe. He's talking to the Jews, and they pick up stones. Their stones are there. They pick up stones to throw at him. Everything is reactionary to what he's saying. This sets a course of action in motion. And that's what our next lesson will be about, how it sets that course of action in motion. So yeah, everything about this, as I said a moment ago, everything about this is planned. Everything about this has a purpose. Okay, next section there, beginning with verse 17. So what information, here John is in his narrator's position. What information does John give us as they arrive in Bethany, verses 17 through 19? John says, so when Jesus came, he found that he, of course being Lazarus, had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So we've got this picture here. Jesus and the disciples arrive, and this is the scene. And note verse 19 again. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brothers. Here we need to know a little bit about the Jewish funeral. As I said earlier, Jews do not embalm. And so when someone dies, they must be buried the same day. That's why it was so important for Jesus to be taken off the cross on that day that he died, because the next day would be the Sabbath, and they couldn't bury him the next day, even though that was getting up to that day of preparation, the day before the Sabbath, was almost over. In the normal... If this had been any other situation, a person dying that close to the end of the day, they probably would have buried them the next physical day. But because the next day was the Sabbath, they couldn't do that. So Jesus had to be hastily buried. We know that he wasn't fully wrapped with the spices. That's why the women go back on the Sunday morning. But they had to get at least partially done. That's why it had to be done that day. So when a person dies, the mourning period begins immediately in the Jewish belief, and it lasts a whole month. Now they have to be buried that day, but the mourning period lasts a whole month. We mentioned Moses a few minutes ago when we said Moses, my servant, is dead. In Deuteronomy 34 verse 8 tells us that when Moses died, so the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Mourning period was 30 days. Now this mourning period is divided into 3 parts. The first 3 days are the most intense. And if you were with us when we actually studied in Matthew the raising of Jairus' daughter in chapter 9, you may remember that the Jewish funerals required professional mourners. You remember that? It was a requirement. They required professional mourners. Can you imagine that's what do you do for a living? I'm a professional mourner. But the Talmud stated that even the poorest of families must have not less than 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman. So if you're really poor, you can just hire 1 wailing woman. If you got a whole bunch of people, then you know the family was really wealthy. But so that takes place on the first 3 days. During the rest of that first week, the mourning, M-O-U-R, I know that sounds like M-O-R-N, but mourning, the sadness, was less intense. And actually, get this, it's the 4th day when friends and family start arriving. How cool is that? So it wasn't that Jesus arrived too late. Jesus arrived right when he was supposed to arrive, being a friend of the family. He was right on time in more ways than one. So here we are, we're on the 4th day, and people are coming because it's the 4th day. And so people from Jerusalem will be coming out. Back there, verse 19. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. This is the 4th day. This is the day that all these people are arriving to mourn with them. Now they had the professional mourners. You had the more intense mourning the first 3 days. Now it's the 4th day. So people are arriving, and someone got word to Martha, who was probably checking on the food. Jesus is here, they said. Verse 20, Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him. but Mary still sat in the house. Did Martha tell Mary where she was going?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Apparently, no, it doesn't appear, because of what she says to her later, but it doesn't appear that she does. And so look at what she says first. Now pay close attention to what she really says in verse 21. Martha therefore said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Is that a reprimand? Is she disappointed?
No, I think she's mad.
You think so? I've seen that in commentaries, that she reprimanded Jesus. Or that, I forget which commentary it was, but one of them had all these things. Of course, they all started with a D. The first one was disappointed. Martha was disappointed. Mary doubted. I forget. But anyway, the first one was disappointed. But notice, pay close attention. Notice what Martha does not say. She does not say, why didn't you come? She says, if you had been here. Look back again at the message in verse 4. Let's see. The message is in verse 3. They sent the message to him saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. Did they ask him to come? Now, when we were going over that part, and all the time I've read this and studied this, I assumed that the implication was, the one you love is sick, come. But that's not what it says. And I'm just throwing this out for thought, okay? That's not what she says to him. Let me make a note. That's verse 3. I've got 4 down here. We, like I said, or at least I, have always assumed that the message was asking here to come. And I've always assumed in reading this that she was bemoaning the fact that he didn't come. Whether she's angry or upset or disappointed, whatever her emotional state is, she's still bemoaning the fact that he didn't come when she sent for him. But now just think about this. Could it be that the message was simply to inform Jesus of the situation? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus knew how dangerous it would be for Jesus to come.
I think he had to allow him to die too.
He did have to allow him to die.
Had he been there, he probably would not.
No, you're exactly right. Had he been there, he would have not died. That it had to play out that way. Mm-hmm. But just in looking at the interaction, but what takes place between right now, Martha and Jesus, they didn't ask him to come. They informed him of the situation. Now, you may still believe it's the other way, and I really don't know which it is, but this really made me think about this closely. Did they really expect him to come, or were they just informing him? They knew why he'd gone to Perea. They knew how dangerous it was for him to be in Judea. And I never looked at it this way before. I never even thought about that, but I think it's possible. I think this is really possible, particularly because of what comes next. So what does she say next? Look at verse 22. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So what did she really expect Jesus to do?
I just look at it as that is a statement of faith coming from her.
It is a statement of faith. But what does she expect him to do?
I don't know that she has an expectation.
She expects him to raise Lazarus.
You think so?
Yeah, I do. That's her. That's her. She's giving him an out.
Yeah.
She's been mad at him.
That just sounds like Martha, though, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, exactly. There's two ways of looking at this scenario. Either that, or she didn't have an expectation, but knowing whatever you say, whatever you do will be the right thing, whether it's raise him or whether it's not. Whatever you do will be the right thing. That's always the first thing that comes to our mind. What she expects him to do? She expects him to raise him from the dead. That's what we expect because we know that's what he's going to do. But look at her words closely. The word ask in verse 22 is a word which means to seek, or actually the word means to beg. But it's a word that is a petition from an inferior to a superior. And by that I mean it's not a question you ask somebody that's on equal basis with you. It's an employee to an employer. It's someone who is under someone else for whatever reason. I know whatever you ask of God, he will do for you.
Can I share something?
Yeah, sure.
I learned on a rabbit chase.
Yeah.
And it almost would plug right in there, but the ancients believed that the soul remained with the body for 3 days.
Right.
This was 4 days.
This was 4 days.
It was too late.
It's too late.
His soul was gone.
Yeah.
What was the need? What was the reason for even trying to bring him back? He had a soul no more.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's almost like a comment of reluctance. Or
Yeah.
just, it's too late already.
It's too late, but
It's too
whatever
late.
you say,
Yeah.
we know is going to be right.
It's too late to bring him back.
Right.
It's been 4 days now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. If you'd got here yesterday while the soul's still hovering
there
around,
was hope. But
yeah.
So I found that to be very,
a resignation on her part.
yeah, just accepting what is.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah,
it's too
yeah. That was the thought of the Jews, was that the soul stayed around for 3 days. Like I said earlier, it was no problem with Jairus' daughter and the widow's son because they had just died. But this is 4 days. The soul is gone now. It's not there.
He was really dead.
He's really dead.
Really dead.
So, but there again, because we know what's going to happen, it's easy to believe that that's what she was asking. And she may have been. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that this is just a different view for me. I had not seen this before.
Well, let's go back a little bit too.
Okay.
They know that he has performed miracles and not been there.
Yeah.
Okay? They send the messenger.
Yeah.
Not to ask, but to make him aware.
Yeah.
Thinking maybe he'll do it and not come and be subject to what they're afraid is going
Yeah.
to happen to him.
Yeah.
And that hasn't happened.
Right. That's a great point, because that sort of marries both of these views. They didn't ask him to come, but they knew he could, and so she may be mad about that. If you'd been here, or if you had healed from a distance like we know you can do.
And why wasn't this important enough to you to go ahead and take care of it?
Yeah. Well, of course, she doesn't know what he said. Well, actually, she does.
That's what the messenger said.
Yeah, the messenger told him.
The
Yeah.
message that he sent back.
Yeah.
Was there a message? Was there a message given?
Yeah, the message is in verse 4. Jesus said, now we read that as him saying it to the disciples. He's saying this to the messenger, essentially, take this message back. This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. But by the time the messenger got back, he was probably already dead. And I'm thinking,
And by now, it's 4 days.
Yeah.
And it's way too long.
it's way too long.
So you wonder if the messenger got to them and got to them.
I'm sure the messenger told her because of what we'll see in a minute. I'm sure he gave her this correct message. Okay, we found my place now.
So I think that Martha went out to meet him because she wanted to talk to him by alone.
Could very well be. Yeah, well, that's Martha's personality.
And it is, she's the practical one. the logical one.
Yeah, exactly.
Although this is her emotions.
True.
Yeah.
You know,
True.
Your emotions sometimes overpower your mind.
I agree.
Right, exactly. So by her saying to him, whatever you ask, being in inferior position to the one you're asking you. Did she really understand who Jesus was and what he could do? And again, I think you're right. I think it's emotion that's playing into this. Emotion, even though she's the practical one, there still is emotion involved there. John MacArthur in his study Bible commentary says, based on her statement that will be coming up in verse 39, she was not saying that she believed Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead, but she knew that Jesus had a special relationship to God so that his prayers could bring something good from this sad event. For you and I, in other words, that's Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. For me, the most powerful part of that verse is the phrase, and we know. There's a difference between knowing and feeling. You have to go on what you know, not on what you feel like. And we know that something good will come from. We don't know what it's going to be, whether or not she's asking him to raise Lazarus or not, but we know something is going to come from this because you said it would. So how did he comfort her? Verse 23. Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. We do the same thing to people. We comfort people in the same way. When we lose a loved one, you'll see them again. And we all know we will. And that is comfort. But there again, there's a difference between what you know in your head and what you're dealing with in your heart and what's leaking out of your eyes at that moment. And let me just throw this out too. Don't let anyone tell you that the Jews did not believe in eternal life. Verse 24, Martha said to him, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. The Jews did believe in eternal life. There are those who say they didn't, but they did. We don't have time to go into the scriptures on that. You can think about David when that child died, or Job when he says, my Redeemer lives, and several scriptures, but they did believe it. But essentially Martha is saying, I know he will someday. But look at how Jesus responded to her statement. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Now, when do we normally hear that? Funerals. You always hear it at funerals. But I always make a point, any time I do a funeral, I be sure and bring up that next question. Do you believe this? Because it doesn't make any difference if Jesus is the resurrection and the life. If you don't believe it, it doesn't help. It doesn't do anything for you. I gave you a scripture there, looking back at chapter 8, verse 51. Jesus told the Jews, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. And we saw then that the word for see means to participate in. Unless the rapture takes place, a believer will experience death. We're all going to experience death unless the rapture happens. But we will never taste it. We will never participate in it. It will not have its claws in us. We'll see it. We'll experience it, but it won't have us. Not the full separation that death entails. And of course, this is another of Jesus' I am statements. But like I said, that question, do you believe this, is the most important. And her answer was, yes, Lord, I have believed you are the Christ, which is, in other words, the Messiah, the Son of God, even the coming one. How many titles for Jesus did she use in that? You are the Lord, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God, you are the coming one. Who else made a similar statement in their declaration of who he was? Who do men say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Remember what Peter said? And so after that, she goes to get Martha. But what title does she use when she went after Martha? Verse 28. When she said this, she went away Mary. She went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, you can imagine the picture. She goes in and whispers into Mary's ear, "The teacher is here, and he's calling for you." Well, Mary just throws everything aside, jumps up and runs out. Well, all the people think she's just overcome with grief. She's headed to the tomb. But any questions before we go on to this next section? Okay, we've had a really good discussion on that. So John sets the scene for us again. Verse 30. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. So Mary's just jumped up and run out of the house. Was she as discreet as Martha was? No, she's just out of there. She just takes off. And so I asked the very question. Who is the more emotional of the two sisters? A very obvious question. Who is the more emotional of the two sisters? Mary, of course. But as I was studying this, and as I've been thinking over this over the past week, this whole, what takes place here between Mary and Martha reminded me of one of my aunts. Mother had, there were 5 sisters of them, so one of the older of Mother's sisters, this aunt, she was very pragmatic, very stoic, and hardly ever showed any emotion. My memo died when I was 10 years old, and my great-grandfather had died when I was 4, but this was my first real experience with death, and I was very close to my mama. She had an aneurysm, and they took her to the hospital, and so I stayed there at Mama's house with this aunt. So when they called from the hospital and said that Mama would likely not make it through the night, I went nuts. I started wailing, kicking and screaming, and this particular aunt said, "Now cut that out." And that's what I needed. There's nothing wrong with showing emotion. There is nothing wrong with mourning, but there is the going off the deep end. I think probably somewhere between my aunt and me at that moment, but cut that out. And I did, because I was a little afraid of her. But I never will forget that, whether it's right or wrong, that's not what I'm after. What I'm after is how different people handle emotion and how different people show love. I have no doubt that this aunt loved her mother as much as my mother loved her. My mother was a little bit more emotional, but it's just difference in people, how we show emotion differently. Mary and Martha were totally different. But what did Mary do when she saw Jesus? Verse 32. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and did what? Fell at his feet. Every time we see Mary in Scripture, she is at Jesus' feet. Somewhere or other, she's at Jesus' feet. But now, what did she say? Did she say, "Why didn't you come?" Even though she would have said it in a different way than Martha. Martha's like, "Why didn't you come?" And Mary would be like, "Why didn't you come?" Did she say, "Why didn't you come"? What did she say?
She said the exact same
She
thing.
exact same thing. If you had been here. Don't you imagine those sisters saying that back and forth to one another over those days that he was sick? If only he was here. Now, whether they expected him to come or not, they still were saying, "Man, if he was only here." Well, it's too dark. I know. But if he was only here. If he'd only, I know. If he was only here. They both felt that same way. Her words were the same, but her actions were not. But the more, and this is my opinion on this, the more I read this, the more I'm convinced, in my opinion, that they did not send the message expecting him to come, but to let him know. Now, I may be wrong on that. And most of the commentaries I've read take the other track.
I like what she said.
Yeah, it does. It marries both of those. Exactly. So look at verse 33. How did Jesus weeping, and the word there does mean wailing. I mean, she is wailing. How did Mary's wailing affect Jesus? Verse 33. When Jesus therefore saw her wailing, and the Jews, here's all these people that have come out of the house with her. You've got the professional mourners, and then you've got all the other people who showed up this fourth day. They come out of the house with her. He was deeply moved in spirit. That's what the New American Standard says. And was troubled. Now, what does your translation say there in verse 33? Is it anything different than deeply moved and was troubled?
I looked it up in another, I guess it's in the Living Testament, and it says a deep anger.
Deep anger,
welled
right.
within him.
What else?
Indignation.
Indignation. That's an interesting one. What else?
It's what you're saying.
Deeply moved.
Yeah.
Deeply moved in spirit. Troubled. Deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now, I told you, because I wanted you to be thinking about this. The word groaned in his spirit literally means to be indignant. That is what the word means, and that means to be angry. And I did what you looked up. The New Living Translation says a deep anger welled up within him. What's that picture do for you? Jesus is angry at this, apparently angry at this weeping. What's that say to you?
I think that it hurt him so for them to have to bear that pain that he would have never ever wanted to put them through that. Could there have been any other way for this to happen?
So is that an anger?
I think he was angry that the plan that he originally had, God, for the world, for man and woman, that, they weren't going to die.
Yeah.
So he was angry at death.
Yeah. I think
that anybody would have to go through.
Anybody would ever have to go through that. I think that's exactly right. Now, a lot of the commentaries might go to great lengths to say that the word really doesn't mean anger. It just means that he felt strongly in his spirit. And the word says angry. The word says indignation. That's really what it says here. But I think you're right. I think it is a picture of Jesus' anger at what sin, and by extension what Satan has done to mankind. Now, some of the commentaries will say that he was angry at these professional mourners, that he was angry at the Jews for making such a show that they weren't really, no. That was their culture. It's what they did. I don't think he's angry at their culture. I think, like we said, he's angry because it had to happen. But because that's what the wages of sin is death. That's what it had to be. He's not mad at the people for weeping. He was not saying like my aunt, now cut it out. He wasn't angry with any of that. In fact, he himself, as we see in a minute, he will weep. Neither is he angry at the Jews who have come here to mourn with the family. That was their custom. It's what they did. It's my opinion, and I believe, as we're saying here, he is angry that this had to happen, that anybody has to die. Well, then, what did he ask? Verse 34, he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, as we've seen this many times in John, "Come and see." And then verse 35, Jesus wept. Why do you think he cried?
He was human.
Yeah.
And overcome with emotion.
Yeah. As we said in the overview, he was fully human.
That's a pretty final scene to behold, too.
Yeah.
Somebody sealed up in, a cave.
Yeah. Yeah. The rock there, the whole bit. See.
There's not sometimes anger and weeping and crying. They're not too far away from each other.
No.
Yeah, that's right. It's a fine line between that. Yeah, that's exactly right. I was looking for this question. I don't know where I put it. I don't know. I may come across it later, but I'll ask it now anyway. So, what I had in my mind was, which is harder, to hurt yourself or to watch somebody else hurt? Yeah. As we said earlier, we can deal with things when it's just us. If we're all we have to deal with, we can do that. But to watch somebody else, and I thought back again about when my mama died. Nobody wants to see their mother cry. You just don't. And I was 10 years old, so I was little. And I remember a week or so later, after Mama died, I went to the mailbox, got the mail, and there was a sympathy card from someone, and that made me angry because I knew it would make Mother cry, and I didn't want to give it to her. I didn't understand. I didn't understand the emotion. I didn't understand that you're going to cry, but I didn't want to have to see it, and so that made me angry for that person to send that card. Of course, I understand that now, but I have a note in my Bible about Jesus weeping. I have a note that says, I think Jesus cried for 3 reasons. First, because he had to let Lazarus die. He knew he could have prevented it. He knew he could have healed him from wherever he was, but he had to let him die. And so he cried. Second, he cried because he hurt with Mary and Martha. We talked about that. It's harder to watch somebody else cry than to cry yourself. And third, think about this. I think he cried because he had to bring Lazarus back from paradise.
That's exactly what I think.
Can you imagine? You're in paradise and it's like,
And see, he knows where Lazarus is.
yeah, he knows where Lazarus is. Now, by the way, this is not the same Lazarus of Luke. I forget what chapter it is with the rich man and Lazarus. That's a parable. That's not this story. Lazarus was a common name, so just don't mix those two stories up. But he knows where he is. He's in paradise.
And is he not going to have to face death again?
He will. I don't remember which commentary it was in. One of the Jewish commentaries, I think, told of an archaeological find in this area, and I don't remember the details on it, the date or anything, or exactly where it was, but the ossuary had on it Lazarus, who was 4 days dead. This was his second entombment.
His final
resting
place.
Final resting place. So that's really interesting.
What did Lazarus ever talk about that?
That's
Everyone did that?
even knowing the outcome, doesn't mean it didn't hurt. But we don't know.
You would think Lazarus prayed to Jesus to help him during his time of
He may
sickness.
have during his sickness. He may have. We don't know that.
He would have had to.
Yeah.
Or you would think he would.
You would think he would. Yeah. We don't know. We're not given those details. But in verses 36 and 37, we see 2 reactions to Jesus' actions, 36 and 37. So they're there at the tomb, and the reactions to Jesus weeping. The Jews were saying, behold how he loved them, but, remember there's always those 2 sides, but some of them were saying, could not this man who opened the eyes of him who was blind have kept him from dying? Well, what's that tell us about them? They were there in Jerusalem. We know that they were there when the blind man was healed. So they arrive at the tomb, verse 38, and again, being deeply moved within, that same indignation, that same anger, they came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone lying against it. Now, this tells us right off the bat how well off this family was, because they had their own private entombment area. This was not a public entombment area. It was theirs. They had a family tomb. And again, Jesus is moved with this internal anger. And like I said earlier, I think it's a picture of his anger at sin's hold on man. But now, what radical thing did he say?
Take away the stone.
Take away the stone. And what did Martha say?
Ew.
Lord, he stinketh. Now, if she expected him to raise Jesus from the dead, if she was asking him to raise Jesus from the dead, why would she say, don't do that? I mean, if you're going to raise him, you're going to have to open the tomb. That's what has that's what has led me to think that she didn't expect him to raise, because she'd have been, hey, let's go right now. I'm going to show you right now where he's at. No, Lord, he's thinking. She doesn't expect that to be the answer. And, how visual that is. That reminds me a little bit of Peter. I have to wonder if they're not related in some shape or form. But it reminded me of that aunt. That's probably what she would have said too. So how did Jesus reply? Verse 40. Look, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Now, when did he tell them that? Back in verse 4, when he sent that message. The message which said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. And by the time they got the message, remember, he was already dead. And so they're thinking, there's got to be something else that's going to come from this. He's already dead. He's going to do something else. Something else good will come. Maybe a lot of people will be saved because of this. We've probably all been at funerals where the salvation message was shared and people were saved. Something good came from someone else's death. We've seen that happen. So maybe that's going through their mind. And then, you mean to tell, you want us to do what? Roll the stone away. If he's going to be raised, the tomb has to be opened. I think she expected to see what good would come from her brother's death, but not that her brother would be brought back to life. So verses 41 and 42. Look at this prayer that Jesus prays. This prayer is a public prayer. And it's public on purpose. This is a prayer that's intended to be heard by other people. I don't know if you've ever taken any classes on praying in public. There was a class that I took once years ago, a lay speaker training class that was on how to lead public prayer. And the one thing that you hear over and over is, you're praying to God. You're not praying for everybody else to hear. People who say, well, I'm afraid to pray in public. And we say to them, you're not praying to everybody else. You're praying to God. So it's just between you and God. But that wasn't the point here. The whole purpose of this prayer was to be heard by everybody else. Don't let anybody tell you that Jesus is against public prayer, because he obviously isn't. I've often said that. What is that? Matthew, I forget what verse it is. Matthew chapter 6. Where Jesus says to go into your closet and pray. I said that's the introvert's favorite verse in the Bible. Go into your closet and pray. But here it's a public prayer and on purpose. So look at what he said, verses 41 and 42. And so they removed the stone, and Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hearest me. And I know that thou hearest me always. But because of the people standing around, I'm saying this so they will hear what I'm saying. Because of the people standing around, I said it, that they may what? Believe that thou didst send me. Then what did he do? Verse 43. And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice. You ever wonder where the phrase loud enough to raise the dead comes from? Jesus wasn't loud in order to, quote, raise the dead. Jesus was loud so that the whole crowd would hear him say this to Lazarus. And of course, you've probably heard the joke. He had to say, Lazarus, come forth, because if he hadn't, everybody else in the graveyard would have come out too.
Never heard that.
You hadn't heard that joke?
It's good.
Might be more truth in it than jokes. So, but John tells us what happened in verse 44. So he who died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. I mean, get this picture in your mind. Here's this man who's been wrapped, bound in cloths from head to toe, strips of cloth. How does he walk out? You know, did you ever think about that? You know, does he take baby steps out? Does he hop? I mean, he's wrapped all the way. I mean, just that image in my mind of him coming out. However he did it, he came out, and Jesus said to unwrap him. But then the story just stops. And we're like, we want to know more. We want to. What happened? What happened with the family next? Did they shout? Did they cry? Did Martha cook up more food? We don't know.
Did they have a covered dish dinner?
Yeah, they had a covered dish dinner. Did other people bring food? I mean, who knows? One thing we do know, Lazarus didn't write a book on 4 days in paradise. We know that. But what does Lazarus have to say about it? We don't know, except that we will see in chapter 12, verse 9, that he does apparently talk about it. We don't know what he said, but he does apparently talk about it, because in chapter 12, verse 9, we read about those who come to hear what Lazarus has to say. So apparently he's got something to say about it. We just don't know what it is. But then verses 45 and 46. Many therefore of the Jews who had come to Mary and beheld what Jesus had done, believed in him. There's that word again. All in. They believed in him. What's the next word? But. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus had done.
It's that little dark cloud just kind of hovering all over.
There's always that. And we'll see next time what ramifications comes from that. So, any other thoughts or comments or any other questions?
That's very difficult when let him out and let him go. And we are right there in that story, and we have no clue.
Yeah.
How it went from there.
Yeah, we were like,
We're just like in a movie or
Yeah.
something, a true life.
You're watching a movie and the power goes out. It's like,
Or the story ends and you go, that wasn't a very good ending.
right. Yeah.
How far was it from where Jesus was to that one?
I didn't get a mileage-wise distance, but most commentaries think that it was at least, I think I have it in here somewhere, I just read over, it was at least a day's journey. So you take the day that the messenger came and went back, and he was already dead, that's day one. He waited 2 more days, that's 3, and then it took him another day to get there, that's the 4th day. So it was about a day's journey. If it was the Bethany beyond the Jordan that some maps I've seen show, that particular Bethany is up close to the Sea of Galilee. It's further up the Jordan River Valley, more to the north, so at least a day's journey. Anything else?
Good lesson.
I enjoyed this lesson. I love those that really force me to look at it differently. Because it had always, the question to me when it said, the one you love is sick, always the question to me was, why didn't he go? Were they asking him to go? And actually, I never really thought about were they asking him. I just assumed that he would go. But really, the one question that really made me start digging into this is when Martha said to him, Lord, if you had been here, he would have not died. And I thought, what did she really want him to do? What did she really expect him to do? And that made me start digging into what they really said. And again, I think it's a marrying of both those emotions that she's dealing with. So yeah, I enjoyed this one. Anything else? All right, I think we're finished for tonight. We'll pray in a few minutes. I can't ever remember how we do that.